A local man's disappearance ignites panic in a rural Appalachian town.
This was not a man that would disappear. This is not a man that would walk away from his life.
Something was really wrong. Someone hurt him.
This is crazy. I don't want to be without him. He's my world.
A gruesome discovery sparks more questions.
We came across a body on the trip.
For all intents and purposes, he was completely decapitated.
As investigators launch a manhunt, a toxic romance takes center stage.
She fell in love with the jailbirds, the troublemakers. I could feel the strain in between them.
They're hiding something. I don't believe that one person could have done that alone.
It was a look in his eyes I ain't ever seen in my life, and it scared me.
Anything that was done in the dark will come to light.
So what did you need to talk to me about?
The truth of the story.
Preston County, West Virginia, is a tight-knit community located in rural Appalachia.
Preston County is right on the edge of the Mason-Dixon line. It's a beautiful area with rolling hills, and the Cheat River runs all the way through the county.
It's just a small community where everybody's there for everybody.
Preston County 911, what's the address of the emergency?
I'm actually driving. I just passed a car on Shower Bath Road that pulled over. They had smoke rolling out the window. It's a truck. It's a marine truck.
Law enforcement was dispatched. First on the scene was Deputy Justin Childers.
617 all day, guys.
As he approached the truck, he noticed that it was still a little bit smoky on the inside.
It almost seems as if somebody's probably trying to set this one on fire.
He can tell that there's been an agent to be able to start a fire, not very successfully, but he can see and smell oil.
Some sort of oil or lubricant or something.
So he calls in the fire department.
Don't touch anything or don't disturb any more than you have to.
Local fire chief Perry Barlow is among the first responders.
When I arrived on scene, I saw the pickup. It kind of reminded me, of my uncle's truck.
The registration was run on it.
Well, it comes back to what, Phil Barlow?
It was identified as Philip Barlow's truck.
That's my uncle. I'm thinking, well, why is my uncle's truck here on Shower Bath Road? Why isn't he here? What's going on?
Works at Hillside.
That's what I said. He should be in a tractor trailer.
Perry says right away, my uncle would not have left the truck in this condition, abandoned and on fire.
My first thought was that somebody possibly stole the truck.
Perry tells detectives that his 61-year-old Uncle Philip, nicknamed Bucky, ought to be at work right now.
So Perry calls Hillside Trucking.
Hey, is my uncle driving today?
And they do confirm that Bucky did not come to work per his usual shift.
Didn't show up today and hadn't heard from him.
Something's wrong because he was very punctual. He was always early.
Kind of an odd place for a fire to start back here, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there was confusion, concern, and I think a sense of urgency to try to locate Bucky.
Philip Bucky Barlow was born into a large and tight-knit family in 1957.
There was 9 of us. He was the next to the youngest.
His dad was a coal miner, and my aunt was a homemaker, and everybody did their share on their farm.
It was a hard life, I would say, but it was a good life.
After dropping out of high school, Bucky started a career as a truck driver.
Trucking was in our blood, so he just fell in, I guess. And by 17 or 18, he was driving truck. And then he drove a truck all his life.
In 2002, Bucky met the woman he would spend the rest of his life with. Her name was Mary Butler.
Me and a friend of mine would go to a place called The Hideaway, and he was sitting with his friends, having fun and drinking. We've seen each other every weekend, and he'd ask me to dance, and I'd get up and I would dance with him.
My Uncle Bucky and Mary were together around 20 years. We did a lot of things together. She would come camping when we were camping, or if we had birthday parties or something, she would come. He thought Mary was the world. He would spend as much time possible with her as he could.
In 2011, Mary made the difficult decision to move back to her home state of Indiana.
As far as us being separated, at times it was hard because he missed me and I missed him. He was gonna look for a job up here, but Bucky doesn't like change. So we decided to wait till he retired and start moving him up here, up to Indiana.
For 8 years, the couple vowed to make the long-distance relationship work. Bucky set the date to move in September 2019.
He counted down the days. He would tell you how many days exactly he had left to retirement.
Bucky was excited that he was gonna retire because he wanted to quit driving truck. And he was excited that he was gonna spend time with me.
But less than 4 months before Bucky was set to join Mary in Indiana, his truck is found abandoned and burned by the side of the road in Preston County.
They've dumped oil all over inside of it and tried to set it on fire.
The investigation of this fire, it was pretty cut and dry. When you see motor oil, still residual motor oil laying on the rear seat, it was deliberately attempted to be set on fire. Motor oil is a combustible, but it's not a very fast burning. It never got a good start.
It's obvious that somebody had done something to this truck. At this point, we don't know. Was it the owner of the vehicle that was trying to do an insurance claim? Was it a stolen vehicle that somebody was trying to destroy for evidence? There's a lot of different possibilities.
After securing the scene on Shower Bath Road, deputies conduct a welfare check at Bucky's home.
Bucky Barlow lived in Tunnelton. It's about a 10 or 15 minute drive from where the vehicle was found. They try to make contact with Bucky, and nobody answers the door. They don't see any signs of a disturbance.
We did not have cause to force entry into his home. At that point, we did not go into his residence.
Bucky's family immediately points investigators to his girlfriend, Mary Butler, currently living out of state.
I got a phone call on May 29th that Bucky did show up for work and that they found his truck. I had 50 million things running through my head at that time. Where could he be? What should I do? I knew there was something wrong.
Coming up, the investigation into Bucky's disappearance leads authorities to a grisly crime.
Preston County 911.
We came across a body.
The jugular was cut, the esophagus was severed, trachea was severed.
And a string of potential suspects will leave investigators baffled about the crime's true motive.
What's this about an argument you had with Bucky? Was it true?
I ain't gonna lie to you.
The evidence was indicative that some kind of intense interaction occurred between multiple people.
If you got dragged into something, right now is the time to fix it.
And now's the time to say, I want a lawyer.
Authorities in Preston County, West Virginia, are searching for 61-year-old Philip Bucky Barlow after collecting evidence that his truck was intentionally set on fire 10 miles away from his home.
We spent like the first 3 days checking all the woods and stuff around his trailer, looking for him.
We looked extensively everywhere.
Nearly 24 hours into the investigation, Bucky's girlfriend, Mary Butler, arrives in Preston County to speak with investigators.
One of the things I noted immediately with Mary is she was genuinely concerned about Bucky's welfare.
I just wish we could find him alive.
I know, I do too.
This is crazy. I don't want to be without him. He's my world.
She described the last time that she spoke with him was the night before, around midnight.
I was at my mom's when Bucky called me when he was getting ready for work.
He would go to work between 12:15 and 12:45.
I told him that I would call him back. And 15 minutes went by, and I called him, and I didn't get any answer.
They shared a cell phone account, and she was able to get onto the account and see the last activity from his cell phone. Mary was the last contact anybody had with him.
While investigators request a ping on Bucky's phone, Mary gives them permission to search Bucky's home.
We looked on the inside of his house, didn't see anything out of place. There was no signs of disturbance.
Investigators canvass Bucky's neighborhood, hoping any activity that suggests where Bucky may have gone.
Just trying to make sure everything's okay.
None of the neighbors indicated that they had heard or saw anything related to Bucky that evening.
The reason I'm stopping is your neighbor there. I wonder if you happen to know when he left or see him leave or...
No.
No camera footage that showed that area that we could locate at that time.
The results of the phone ping offer investigators few clues.
It was about a half a mile from his house when it stopped transmitting. The direction it traveled was the direction he would have went to go to work. We searched the area for the phone, but we were unsuccessful in finding it.
The following day, authorities escalate their search efforts.
Captain Tichenal brings in the National Guard aerial units that do surveillance in the air. We employed canine units to come in.
Preston County is a very rough terrain, and to search it is a very daunting task.
There was a real sense of urgency. This was not a man that would disappear. This is not a man that would walk away from his life.
"10 days into the search, authorities receive a call from a local hunter.
Preston County 911.
We're just down here hunting, and we came across a bomb in the creek.
The creek is called Fortney's Mill. From Tunnelton, it's about a 20-minute drive to get there. Very isolated, desolate area. Once I got on scene, myself and another officer were able to approach the body. It was moderately decomposed. He did not have a shirt on. His jeans were around his ankles, and he was face down in the water.
When the medical examiner came on scene, we were able to flip the body. When they removed the dentures of this individual, it indicated P. Barlow. And so we knew then.
There was a significant injury to his throat area. The jugular was cut, the artery was cut, the esophagus was severed, trachea was severed.
Mr. Barlow was, for all intents and purposes, completely decapitated. He was just as brutally injured as you can imagine.
Shock. You know, you don't want to believe that it actually happened. Nobody should die that way.
I was hysterical because I didn't want it to be true.
I lost my best friend. I'm not one to show emotional, but it tore me up inside bad.
The family wanted answers. Bucky did not deserve this. Because of the nature of the crime, we have to look at the people closest to him, and that would undoubtedly be Mary. They completed a polygraph, which she passed. She provided hours of interviews to the sheriff's department with Captain Tichenal, and there was just nothing pointing to Mary.
I loved him. We had a good relationship most of the time.
Instead, Mary offers investigators a new name.
She indicates that there had been some type of altercation or dispute between his neighbor, Craig, and Bucky.
I knew there had been an argument and a scuffle with Craig, and I said, stay away from him. Just leave him alone. Don't say nothing.
After recovering the remains of Bucky Barlow from a remote creek in Preston County, West Virginia, authorities have learned that the 61-year-old had been involved in an altercation with his neighbor, Craig.
Craig was living in the back trailer behind Bucky. There always was bickering and fighting back and forth all the time. He would cut through the yard, and Bucky didn't like it. So that would cause arguments. So on Sunday, Bucky decided he wanted to cut the grass. And Craig had left some stuff on the grass. And Bucky had called me and told me about the scuffle. Then that's when he came up missing.
Investigators immediately follow this new lead and contact Craig.
We located Craig where he had been living, which is located almost directly behind Bucky's residence. So what's this about an argument you had with Bucky? Was it true?
We actually, yeah, we really did. I ain't gonna lie to you.
He explained the conflict that he had with Bucky was about the property line.
According to Craig, the dispute began when Bucky accused him of leaving garbage bags on his property.
He come up there, and he could move. And I'd have run to the truck. I grabbed it off club out of the back. I chased him around. I wasn't close enough to hit him, but I did swing it at him.
Craig admits that the incident in question happened just a week before Bucky's disappearance.
Craig denied that he had any knowledge or participation in anything that may have happened to Bucky. The night that Bucky disappeared, he said that night he had been working on the radio in the truck. He described the location. It's a back road.
I slept in that Ranger.
You slept in the Ranger all night?
Yeah.
Was anybody with you?
No.
I did question him, why would you sleep in your truck that night when your residence is fairly close? At some point, you're going to wake up in the night. Would you agree with that? You're going to be like, I might as well go home, I'm only 5 minutes away. And he described that that was not out of the norm for him.
I did not leave that spot.
Craig tells them the truck he slept in belongs to a friend named Chris. Following Craig's interview, investigators contact Chris to see if he can corroborate his friend's claims.
They go to look for Chris, and his wife, Debbie, is at the residence, and she agrees to go to the sheriff's department for an interview.
The night that guy came up missing, Craig sent a message to Chris. The message said, if anybody comes asking, I was with you guys all night.
Investigators turn their attention to Chris and bring him in for a formal interview.
Have you talked to Craig since this guy went missing? No text messages?
No, nothing about him.
He denied ever seeing a text message from Craig asking him to provide him with an alibi. Chris, during the initial interview, said that he was home pretty much the entire night. He denied any knowledge or any participation in Bucky's disappearance.
You ever look at your phone?
We were able to corroborate, at the very least, Chris's phone was at his residence.
His cell phone records did not show any evidence that he had been involved in anything that night.
The following day, investigators bring Craig in for a formal interview and confront him about the claim that he had asked his friend for an alibi.
Now, let me get you all strapped in here.
Craig was asked to polygraph.
Did you in any way participate in the disappearance of Bucky? No.
And he passed that polygraph.
All right, torture's over.
Craig allows investigators to search his phone.
We didn't find anything to suggest that he was a part of the disappearance.
Debbie's allegation that Craig sent a text message requesting an alibi was never corroborated. Officers never located that text message.
The absolutely ridiculous amount of false information and rumors that were spread, it severely impeded getting this case resolved. So once we ruled them out as potential suspects,
appreciate it.
We were basically back to square one in the investigation.
Coming up, a seemingly insignificant detail catches investigators' attention and spins the case in a whole new direction.
Captain Tichenor reevaluates some evidence that he has, and he finds something.
So you guys were home all night?
You can't hear nothing or nothing in there with the air conditioning on.
It's a small lie, but why are they not telling the truth?
And the revelation of a sordid betrayal pits two suspects against one another.
Better be thankful when I get out. All right, I love you, baby.
She's not faithful to you. You just heard it.
I find her to be manipulative, cold, evil, and a very disturbed woman.
Authorities in Preston County, West Virginia, have been searching for answers in the brutal murder of Bucky Barlow for 8 months.
My family and I, we feared that it would be a cold case.
My Bible tells me that anything that was done in the dark will come to light. So somebody needs to pay for this.
In January of 2020, Detective Tichenor meticulously reviews the case file, looking for anything that might give the case some traction.
He has gone above and beyond to exclude people. So in typical Travis Tichenor fashion, he goes back and he reevaluates some evidence that he has, being some statements from Laura Martin and Bobby Quinn. Laura Martin and Bobby Quinn were interviewed by Captain Tichenor, really just to get Captain Tichenor's head wrapped around who the neighbors were.
Their residence sit directly next to Bucky's residence. During the conversation with Mr. Quinn and Miss Martin, nothing out of the ordinary was noted. Nothing stood out to law enforcement at that time with them. I went back and listened to those statements again.
So you guys were home all night?
Yeah, we was in bed and, well, you can't hear nothing in there with the air conditioning on.
He spontaneously said that he didn't hear anything because of the air conditioning. And Laura essentially said the same thing, just not to the same degree of the spontaneousness of it.
It's like your vehicle pulling in, and if you step inside the house there and you can't hear nothing because we got an air conditioner going.
That kind of stood out to me, that it just seemed a little bit out of context. Seemed like a pretty minute detail to have specifically remembered. I wanted to speak with them again.
He looks for Bobby Quinn and Laura Martin, and he locates them in Garrett County Jail. They were incarcerated in Maryland for a string of breaking and enterings into storage units.
That's when I went to the Garrett County Jail where they were being housed and interviewed them again. I'm still working on
figuring out all the circumstances with Bucky's disappearance and death. How well did you know him?
I really not very good.
Okay, and you didn't hear anything?
No. We had the air conditioner on.
When investigators sit down with Laura, she now mentions a different reason.
Did you hear anything that night?
No. Like I told you then, I had the washer and dryer running.
Okay.
So she said the washer and dryer. That was not consistent with what she had previously said. And he stayed consistent with the air conditioner. I felt at that point that might be onto something on this.
In an effort to corroborate their claims, Detective Tichnell reaches out to the couple's neighbor, Janice Maxwell.
And that's the first thing he asked me on Laura's house. Was there an air conditioning unit in the window? I said no.
It's a small lie, but why are they not telling the truth?
So at this point, I knew they were absolutely hiding something and lying about the activities of that night.
Hoping to learn more about the couple, investigators contact Laura's daughter, Cheyenne. Cheyenne tells authorities that her mom has lived in Preston County her whole life.
She was 19 when she got pregnant with me. She was over the moon and over the stars for me and my little sister. But at the same time, she was trying to make a living to provide for me and my sister. It wasn't always easy.
Her criminal activity really begins in 2002. So she's a young adult at this point, and she's committing burglaries, grand larcenies, and obstructing an officer.
When her children were still young, Laura split up with their father.
I love her to death, but she does not know how to pick a man. She fell in love with the jailbirds, the troublemakers. Their relationships never really lasted long.
In October 2018, Laura met Robert Quinn through an ex-boyfriend.
She fell for him head over heels.
Robert Quinn is born in 1977. He grew up in New Martinsville, the youngest of 9 siblings. His father was a steel mill worker. His mother was a stay-at-home wife.
After dropping out of high school, Robert began working full-time.
He was working railroad, so he's bringing in a good amount of money.
In 2018, Robert moved into Laura's trailer on Number 4 Road, where she had been living next door to Bucky Barlow.
Laura Martin's dad, Kenny, lived next door. Kenny had died. And then it was Laura and Robert living there. Friendship? No. Hi? As you go by, yeah. Their dog kept coming over, and Bucky didn't like them in the yard and stuff like that. And he would tell them, keep your dogs over by your own house.
Bucky was more to himself. He did his thing, we did our things.
While Cheyenne can't confirm her mother or Robert's alibis the night of Bucky's disappearance, she believes that her mother isn't capable of the crime.
She can be vicious, but not someone I would see as ever killing vicious.
Despite Cheyenne's belief that Laura had nothing to do with Bucky's death, Detective Tichnell trusts his instinct to dig even deeper into the couple.
During the investigation, I requested from the Garrett County Jail all of Mr. Quinn and Miss Martin's jail calls. I want to see who they were communicating with and if there was anything being mentioned about the murder investigation. Robert had very few calls, but Miss Martin had significantly more, including to an ex-boyfriend named Mark.
During these jail calls, she is being sexually explicit with Mark, telling him things she wants to do to him.
By this time, there had been no digital evidence, no forensic evidence, no physical evidence. We had nothing on this case. So on October 7th, 2020, myself, Deputy Pally, and the assistant prosecuting attorney went to the Garrett County Jail to try to get a resolution to this.
Hoping to use Laura's infidelity as a means to get Robert Quinn to open up, investigators sit down with Robert on October 7th, 2020.
Do you know what her relationship is right now with her ex?
No.
Okay, it's probably not exactly what you think it is.
I made about a 90-second to 2-minute greatest hits of the filth that she was saying to her ex-boyfriend. And at that point, I played him those greatest hits.
You know what I need? You for about 20 minutes. You know I'm hitting it one more time, right? Better be single when I get out. All right, I love you, baby.
She's not faithful to you. You just heard it.
So once the jail calls are played, then Bobby says, well, she may not have been there all night. And he starts to distance himself from Laura Martin. And that's the first time that occurs. He says Laura confessed to murdering Bucky Barlow.
More than a year after the murder of 61-year-old Bucky Barlow, investigators continue interviewing his neighbor, Robert Quinn, who has claimed that his girlfriend, Laura Martin, was responsible for the crime.
I'm done bullshitting right now.
He says, I need to tell you the truth. And he immediately says it was Laura's idea to rob Bucky.
How much money did you hear about? Thousands, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They heard he had a large sum of cash.
Robert says that they believed that because he was retiring that he would have some money. Why they believed he would be carrying it in his pocket, I don't know.
Went sideways, didn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Why did it go sideways?
She went over to Bucky's by herself, and she was staying there waiting for him to get to work. And whenever I come off his porch, she grabbed hold of him, tried to rob him, and he put up a fight.
He describes how Laura hit Bucky and a physical altercation ensues. Bobby says he only comes outside because it's getting more and more physical, and he needs to become involved at that point. They get Bucky in the vehicle, and he sits in the back seat with Bucky. She threw Bucky's phone out the window while they were driving to Fortney's Mill.
Once they got him to Fortney's Mill, they took him under the bridge.
Did you know she was going to kill him?
No, I had no idea.
Okay.
Investigators ask Robert if he'll return to the scene, and he agrees.
He sat right here on the ledge. All right.
She took his wallet.
She told him to get down on your knees and that.
Okay, can you kind of recreate what you saw her do?
She came up behind him, and she grabbed him by the hair of the head, and she kind of like stabbed him in the front of the neck and went around to the side. And he was on his knees probably like 2 or 3 minutes, and he fell over. And then she rolled him in the water. Well, he only had like $50. And I told her, I said it really wasn't worth the man's life. She said, well, you just shut up or you'll be the next one to go.
Okay.
And I didn't say no more to her.
He said she drove the truck back up to Kingwood, where Laura tried to light the truck on fire. So once we had Mr. Quinn's statement and his version of the events, my next move was to take it back to Laura Martin. When she realized that Mr. Quinn had, in fact, rolled on her. That's when Miss Martin gave her rendition of the events.
It was supposed to be a burglary, and that's my idea. I'm not even gonna lie.
Okay.
But as far as killing him, no, that was not my idea at all. Like, I don't have it in my heart to hurt anybody, not like that.
Laura tells investigators that on the night of May 29th, she and Robert waited outside Bucky's door wearing masks and gloves.
We had BB guns, but they looked like regular guns.
Laura Martin says things went too far. Quinn starts roughing up Bucky.
It was a struggle with all three of us. I mean, I wasn't gonna let him get the best of me. I mean, I was freaking bleeding and everything because I got smacked around. I can't be mad. You know, he's defending himself.
I'm begging him to stop. He's yelling at me to get in the truck.
Laura claims that they drove to the creek where Robert attacked Bucky.
Bobby pulled a box cutter out. And I'm like, what the Then I saw Bobby cut him. I shoved Bobby and I put my hands on Bucky's neck. And I'm looking at Bobby and I'm crying and I'm like, please don't do this.
She makes herself out to be kind of the hero trying to save Bucky.
And then Bobby's like, I'll kill you too. And like, there was a look in his eyes I ain't ever seen in my life, and it scared me. It really did.
Following their confessions, investigators must now determine who is telling the truth.
They were basically pointing the finger at each other, but I don't believe that one person could have done that alone.
More than a year after Bucky Barlow's murder, detectives have obtained the confessions of his next-door neighbors, Laura Martin and Robert Quinn.
Okay.
The couple is extradited from Maryland to West Virginia in October of 2020. Both are charged with first-degree murder.
Quinn, I wasn't surprised for one bit. I wasn't. My mother, I really was in shock for what happened.
Travis promised me, he said, I will find out who did this to your uncle. And he came through on that promise.
As authorities prepare for trial, they receive a call that sheds more light on the couple's conflicting stories.
We had multiple inmates that were incarcerated with Miss Martin at the Garrett County Jail that came forward. She admitted to them that she had killed Bucky, and she made some very disturbing statements.
Laura indicated that she loved the way Bucky's blood felt running through her hands, and that she wanted to feel that sensation again.
Miss Martin also claimed to her fellow jail inmates that after they killed Bucky, she and Robert took his lunch that he had packed for his shift and ate his sandwiches with his blood still on their hands.
It was horrifying, to put it in a simple word. The way that she described the pure joy that she felt is something that I'll never forget.
What I found was Miss Martin and Mr. Quinn's relationship. She was definitely the dominant personality in the two. She basically wore the pants of the two of them.
I find her to be manipulative, cold, evil, and a very disturbed woman.
Even with the assertions of 3 jailhouse informants, prosecutors have concerns.
When you have two people who are trying to pin the ultimate act of slashing the throat and committing the murder on each other, there's always a worry that that will confuse a couple of jurors. And, you know, all it takes is one. If one juror is convinced that there's something wrong with the case, they can hang the jury.
Prosecutors offer Laura and Robert a plea deal, and they accept. On October 5th, 2022, the couple is sentenced.
Judge Schaefer sentenced Ms. Martin and Mr. Quinn to 180 years on the first-degree armed robbery and 15 years to life on the first-degree murder, and ran those sentences consecutively.
They will never see the light of day outside of a prison.
When they told me what the sentence was, I cried. I went up and I shook the judge's hand.
Just knowing that Laura and him are off the streets, your whole neighborhood at least feels a little bit safer. But you just can't imagine thinking that this happened in this small town over such a stupid thing of just a robbery.
Who takes someone's life for $50? I give him $1,000 to not hurt him. Like, there's no reason for it. To know what they put him through, it's hard that anybody could do that to somebody, especially for $50.
I believe Laura Martin is a product of her environment, her upbringing, her psychological tendencies, but it doesn't make her a victim. I believe she would kill again.
I know her sentence wasn't too harsh. She did what she did, and she got what she deserved.
Uncle Bucky will be remembered for his easygoing personality and a love of family, and he touched a lot of people's lives.
I remember him as a fantastic person. He was good to me, and I wanted him to be with me for the rest of his life. My partner, somebody that I loved and I'll never get back.
In February of 2000, in the quiet rural town of Aberdeen, in New South Wales, Australia, nothing about the morning seemed extraordinary, at least not at first. The town moved as it always did, shaped by routine, by familiarity, by the steady rhythm of lives that rarely strayed far from expectation. People woke up, prepared for work, exchanged the usual greetings. In places like this, routine isn't just habit, it's a kind of unspoken agreement. And when that rhythm is broken, even in the smallest way, it doesn't go unnoticed. That morning, someone failed to arrive. John Charles Thomas Price was not the kind of man who simply disappeared from his responsibilities. He was known among those around him as dependable, steady, someone who showed up when he was supposed to, the kind of person whose presence you could count on without needing to think twice about it. Which is why, when he didn't come to work, it didn't feel like a coincidence. It felt wrong. At first, the concern may have been quiet, almost dismissible. People miss a shift sometimes. Things happen. But there's a difference, subtle, but unmistakable, between an absence that can be explained and one that cannot. And for those who knew John Price, this absence did not come with an easy explanation. It lingered. It raised questions. It unsettled. There are moments in cases like this where the story begins long before anyone realizes it has started, where warning signs exist, quietly accumulating beneath the surface, invisible to those not looking closely enough, or perhaps visible but not fully understood. By the time someone notices that something is wrong, the truth has already taken shape. By the time concern becomes action, it is often too late to change what has already happened. As the hours passed, the unease surrounding Price's absence grew more difficult to ignore. This wasn't just about a missed shift anymore. It was about a pattern being broken. And in a town where patterns matter, where people notice the smallest deviations, that break carried weight. Eventually, concern gave way to decision. Authorities were contacted. What began as a simple question, "Where is John Price?" was about to turn into something far more serious. When police arrived at his home, they were not stepping into the unknown. Not entirely. They were responding to a concern, yes, but also to a feeling, an intuition shared by those who had already begun to sense that this was not a normal situation. And in cases like this, those instincts are often grounded in something real, something that has been building quietly out of sight. Inside the house, there were immediate signs that something was very wrong. This was not a situation that required prolonged interpretation or uncertainty. It was clear, almost instantly, that a serious crime had taken place. The kind of crime that changes not only the lives of those directly involved, but also the understanding of everyone who hears about it afterward. And within that space, at the center of it all, was a presence that would come to define the case. Catherine Knight. She was there when police arrived. Not hidden, not gone, present. And that detail alone would shape everything that followed. Because this was not a mystery in the traditional sense. This was not a case built on unknown suspects or complex webs of possibility. The answers, at least in part, were already in the room. But understanding how those answers came to be, understanding what led to that moment in that house, on that morning, would require looking back. It would require examining a relationship that had not begun in violence, but had moved toward it, step by step, over time. It would require acknowledging the warning signs that had been present long before that day, the concerns that had been voiced, the fear that had been felt. Because what happened to John Price did not emerge from nowhere. It did not exist in isolation. It was connected to history, to behavior, to patterns that had repeated themselves before. And, perhaps most importantly, it was connected to something deeply human and deeply complicated. The dynamics of a relationship that had become increasingly unstable, increasingly dangerous. Even as it continued, in the days and months that followed, this case would be discussed across Australia. It would be described as shocking, disturbing, difficult to comprehend. But those descriptions, while accurate in their own way, do not fully capture what makes a case like this so unsettling. Because at its core, this is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about recognition, about what happens when someone senses danger but remains within its reach, about how patterns of behavior can escalate slowly until they reach a point from which there is no return. And as we begin to look more closely at what happened in Aberdeen in February of 2000, it becomes clear that this story does not start with the discovery of a crime. It starts much earlier, with two people, Catherine Knight and John Charles Thomas Price, whose lives became intertwined in ways that would ultimately lead to one of the most serious domestic violence cases in the country's history. To understand what happened in Aberdeen in February of 2000, it is necessary to step back from the moment of discovery and look instead at the people whose lives converged long before that morning. At the center of this story is John Charles Thomas Price, a man whose life, by all outward appearances, followed a steady and predictable path. He was known among co-workers and acquaintances as reliable, the kind of person who adhered to routine without drawing attention to himself. In smaller communities, that kind of consistency becomes part of a person's identity. It is not simply about punctuality or responsibility, it is about trust. People come to expect that you will be where you say you will be, doing what you said you would do. And Price fit that expectation. There is nothing in his daily life that suggested volatility or unpredictability. Instead, what defined him most clearly was a sense of normalcy, a quiet stability that rarely gives cause for concern. But stability, as it often turns out, can exist alongside risk, especially when it intersects with the complexities of a relationship that is anything but stable. Price's personal life, particularly his relationship with Catherine Knight, introduced a different kind of pattern, one that did not align with the calm consistency he otherwise maintained. Their relationship began in the mid-1990s, at a time when neither of them could have fully anticipated where it would lead. Like many relationships, it developed gradually, shaped by shared time and emotional connection. But unlike relationships that settle into balance, theirs was marked by fluctuation, periods of closeness followed by conflict, separation followed by reconciliation. This cycle, repeating over time, became a defining feature of their dynamic. Each return suggested the possibility of change, of improvement, of resolution. And yet, each cycle also carried forward the unresolved tensions of the last. To understand why those tensions mattered, It is important to look more closely at Knight herself, not in a way that excuses or explains away what would later happen, but in a way that acknowledges the patterns that were already present. Catherine Knight grew up in an environment shaped by violence. Exposure to that kind of environment, particularly over long periods of time, can leave lasting imprints on behavior and perception. It can influence how conflict is understood, how control is asserted, how relationships are navigated. In Knight's case, those influences manifested in ways that would become increasingly visible over time. She had a documented history of aggressive behavior, particularly within her intimate relationships. This was not limited to isolated incidents. It formed a pattern, one that included controlling tendencies, threats, and acts that caused harm to previous partners. These were not hidden aspects of her past. They existed as part of her history, known to those who had been close to her. And while past behavior does not always dictate future outcomes, it can serve as a warning, a signal that certain dynamics may repeat if left unaddressed. Within her relationship with Price, those dynamics began to emerge with increasing clarity. What may have started as disagreements or emotional tension gradually escalated into something more serious. The pattern of breaking up and reconciling did not resolve the underlying issues. Instead, it allowed them to persist, to resurface, often with greater intensity each time. For Price, this created a situation that was both emotionally complicated and potentially dangerous. On one hand, there was the familiarity of the relationship, the shared history, the moments of connection that made reconciliation seem possible. On the other, there was the growing awareness that something was not right. That awareness did not appear suddenly. It developed over time, shaped by experience, reinforced by behavior that became increasingly difficult to ignore. At some point, Price began to express concern to others. He told friends that he feared Knight might harm him. This is a critical detail, not because it changes the outcome, but because it reveals his perception of the situation before the final events unfolded. Fear, in this context, is not abstract. It is grounded in observation, in experience, in the accumulation of moments that signal risk. When someone articulates that kind of fear, it suggests that the warning signs are no longer subtle. They have become clear enough to name. And yet, even with that awareness, leaving the relationship entirely proved difficult. Price made efforts to create distance. He attempted to step back, to limit contact, to move away from the volatility that had come to define the relationship. But those efforts did not result in a complete separation. The connection remained, however strained, however uncertain. This is not uncommon in situations involving controlling or aggressive dynamics. Relationships are rarely defined by a single moment of decision. Instead, they're shaped by a series of choices, each influenced by emotion, history, and circumstance. The presence of fear does not always lead to immediate departure. There can be hesitation, doubt, hope for change, or simply the challenge of disentangling lives that have become intertwined over time. As a relationship continued, the imbalance between stability and volatility became more pronounced. Price's external life remained consistent: his work, his routines, his interactions with others. But within the private space of the relationship, tension persisted. It is in that contrast that the underlying risk becomes most visible. From the outside, everything appears normal. From the inside, the situation is far more uncertain. By the time February of 2000 arrived, the relationship between Price and Knight had already passed through multiple cycles of conflict and reconciliation. The patterns were established. The warning signs have been expressed. The sense of unease was no longer hypothetical. And yet, the connection between them had not been fully severed. This is where the story becomes particularly difficult to confront, because it challenges the assumption that recognition of danger is always enough to prevent harm. In reality, recognition is only one part of a much more complex process. It does not guarantee action, and it does not ensure safety. As we move closer to the events of that final night, it is important to hold on to this context, not as justification, but as understanding. What happened in that house did not occur in isolation. It was the result of a relationship that had been shaped over time by patterns of behavior, by unresolved conflict, and by warning signs that, while visible, were not enough to alter the course of events. And at the center of that relationship were two individuals whose lives had become deeply entangled: John Charles Thomas Price, who had begun to fear what might happen, and Catherine Knight, whose past and present behavior pointed toward a level of instability that had not been resolved. It is within this context that the events of that night must be understood, not as a sudden break from normalcy, but as the culmination of something that had been building quietly but persistently, long before anyone called the police. By the time the night in February of 2000 arrived, the relationship between Catherine Knight and John Charles Thomas Price had already been shaped by cycles of tension, separation, and uneasy reconciliation. Nothing about their history suggested calm resolution. Instead, it pointed toward instability, toward a pattern that had repeated often enough to become familiar, but no less dangerous for that familiarity. On that particular night, after a period marked by strain and distance, Knight came to Price's home in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia. The setting itself was not unusual. It was a private space, one that had likely witnessed both ordinary moments and difficult conversations before. But what made this visit different was not the location, it was the emotional context surrounding it. There had been tension leading up to this moment. The relationship was not in a stable place. And when individuals carry unresolved conflict into a confined space, the potential for escalation is always present. At some point during the night, an argument began. The exact words exchanged are not part of the available record. But what is clear is that the confrontation did not remain contained. It intensified. This was not a brief disagreement or a passing moment of frustration. It was a serious conflict, one that reflected the deeper issues that had been present in the relationship for some time. In situations like this, escalation rarely happens all at once. It builds. Emotion feeds into reaction, reaction into further emotion, until the situation reaches a point where control is lost. For Price, this was not entirely unexpected. He had already expressed fear to others. He had already recognized that the relationship carried risk. But recognition, as important as it is, does not always translate into immediate safety. In that moment, inside his own home, he was still within reach of the very danger he had once tried to distance himself from. As the confrontation escalated, the situation crossed a threshold from conflict into violence. What followed was the killing of John Price. It occurred within the walls of his own home, a space that, under normal circumstances, represents security and privacy. The fact that it happened there underscores the deeply personal nature of the crime. This was not random. It was not opportunistic. It was the result of a relationship that had deteriorated to the point where violence became its most extreme expression. In recounting events like this, there's often a temptation to focus on the physical details, to attempt to reconstruct every moment with precision. But those details, while part of the factual record, do not necessarily deepen understanding. What matters more is the recognition of how the situation reached that point, how a series of unresolved tensions, repeated patterns, and escalating behaviors culminated in a single irreversible act. The night did not end with the argument. It did not resolve itself. Instead, it gave way to silence, the kind of silence that follows when something final has occurred. Outside, the town remained unchanged. There was no immediate signal, no outward indication that anything extraordinary had taken place inside that house. Life continued, as it often does, unaware of what has already happened behind closed doors. This contrast, the normalcy of the outside world against the reality of what had just occurred, adds a layer of disquiet to the event, because it reminds us that some of the most significant and devastating moments unfold in private, without witnesses, without interruption. Within that silence, Catherine Knight remained in the house. This detail is important, not because it explains her actions, but because it reflects the absence of an attempt to conceal or flee in the immediate aftermath. The events of the night did not lead to disappearance or evasion. Instead, they remained contained within that space, waiting to be discovered. And discovery, when it came, would not be the result of chance. It would begin with something far more ordinary: absence. The following morning, when John Charles Thomas Price did not appear at work, the disruption of routine set the next stage in motion. What had happened during the night remained unknown for several hours, but its consequences had already begun to ripple outward. Concern grew, questions formed, and eventually, action was taken. But by that point, the outcome of the night was already fixed. There would be no intervention, no opportunity to alter the course of events. The critical moment had passed. What remained was the process of uncovering what had happened, of piecing together the final chapter of a relationship that had long been defined by instability. In looking back at that night, it is important to resist the urge to see it as a sudden break from the past. It was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern that included aggression, control, fear, and repeated cycles of conflict. Each of those elements played a role in shaping the outcome. Each contributed, in its own way, to the escalation that ultimately led to violence. And while the exact sequence of moments may never be fully reconstructed in detail, the broader trajectory is clear. The relationship between Catherine Knight and John Charles Thomas Price had reached a point where the risk that had once been anticipated became reality. What had been feared was no longer hypothetical. It had happened, and it had happened in the most personal of spaces, under circumstances that reflected not just a single moment of conflict, but the accumulated weight of everything that had come before it. The transition from uncertainty to confirmation in cases like this often happens quickly, but never without weight. By the morning following the night of the incident, the absence of John Charles Thomas Price had already begun to draw attention. What initially appeared as a deviation from routine had, within a matter of hours, evolved into something that required formal concern. When a person known for consistency fails to appear without explanation, especially in a close-knit working environment, the silence they leave behind becomes difficult to ignore. It was this silence, uncharacteristic and unresolved, that prompted those around him to act. Co-workers, recognizing that his absence did not align with his usual behavior, made the decision to alert authorities. This moment, though simple in action, marked a critical turning point. It shifted the situation from personal concern to official inquiry, setting in motion the investigative process that would soon uncover the reality of what had taken place. When police arrived at Price's home in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia, they were entering a situation that, while not yet fully understood, already carried the weight of suspicion. Officers responding to welfare concerns are trained to assess quickly, to determine whether an absence is benign or indicative of something more serious. In this case, that determination did not take long. Upon entering the residence, it became immediately apparent that this was not a routine check. There were clear indications that a serious and violent crime had occurred. The nature of those indications, while not necessary to describe in detail, was sufficient to remove any ambiguity. This was no longer a question of locating a missing person. It was the beginning of a homicide investigation. One of the most significant aspects of this initial response was the presence of Catherine Knight at the scene. She had not left the residence. She had not attempted to distance herself from the location where the events had unfolded. Instead, she remained there when authorities arrived. This fact shaped the trajectory of the investigation from the outset. In many cases, investigators must work to identify potential suspects, to reconstruct timelines, to determine who may have had access or motive. Here, however, one of the central figures in the case was already present. This did not eliminate the need for investigation, but it did narrow its immediate scope. Officers on the scene moved quickly to secure the area, preserving evidence and ensuring that the integrity of the investigation would not be compromised. Standard procedure in such situations involves isolating the scene, documenting its condition, and beginning the careful process of collecting information. Each detail, no matter how small, contributes to a broader understanding of what occurred. In this case, the physical evidence within the home provided a clear narrative. There were no signs to suggest the involvement of an unknown third party. No indications of forced entry by an outsider. No evidence that would point investigators toward an alternative suspect. Instead, everything present within the scene pointed inward, toward the interaction that had taken place between Price and Knight during the previous night. This convergence of evidence allowed investigators to establish, with a high degree of certainty, the basic outline of events. While the precise sequence of actions within the confrontation may not have been fully reconstructible in every detail, the conclusion regarding responsibility was not in question. The absence of competing explanations, combined with the presence of direct and circumstantial evidence, led to a clear determination. Catherine Knight was responsible for the death of John Charles Thomas Price. As a result, she was placed under arrest at the scene. This immediate arrest is notable not because it is unusual in cases with strong evidence, but because it reflects the clarity with which investigators were able to interpret the situation. There was no prolonged search for suspects, no extended period of uncertainty. The case, in its foundational aspects, was established early. However, establishing responsibility is only one part of an investigation. The process that follows involves documenting the case in a way that meets legal standards, ensuring that all evidence is properly collected, preserved, and analyzed, and preparing for the eventual judicial proceedings. Investigators would have worked methodically to compile a complete record of the scene, to corroborate findings, and to ensure that the case could withstand scrutiny in court. This includes not only physical evidence, but also contextual information, background details about the relationship, prior incidents, and any statements made by those involved or by individuals who had knowledge of the situation leading up to the event. In this context, the prior history between Knight and Price became an important component of the investigative narrative. The documented pattern of conflict, the history of aggressive behavior, and the expressions of fear made by Price contributed to a broader understanding of the circumstances. These elements did not replace the need for physical evidence, but they provided context, helping to explain how the situation may have escalated to the point of violence. Another key aspect of the investigation was the absence of complexity in terms of competing theories. In some cases, investigators must navigate multiple possibilities, weighing different scenarios and attempting to reconcile conflicting pieces of evidence. Here, the consistency of the evidence simplified that process. The scene, the presence of Knight, and the lack of alternative explanations all aligned in a way that directed the investigation toward a single, coherent conclusion. This does not diminish the seriousness of the work involved. On the contrary, it underscores the importance of thoroughness, even when the outcome appears clear. Every step must be documented. Every assumption must be supported by evidence. Because ultimately, the findings of the investigation must be presented within a legal framework, where the standard is not simply belief, but proof. As the investigation progressed, the focus began to shift from discovery to preparation. The question was no longer what had happened, but how it would be presented in court. The evidence collected at the scene, combined with the contextual background of the relationship, formed the basis of the case against Catherine Knight. And given the strength of that evidence, the trajectory toward prosecution was direct. There would be no need for prolonged uncertainty, no unresolved threads requiring extended inquiry. Instead, the case moved steadily toward its next phase, the legal process that would determine the consequences of what had occurred. In reflecting on the investigative stage of this case, what stands out is not complexity, but clarity. The events of that night, while rooted in a complicated relationship, resulted in a situation where the evidence spoke with a unified voice. For investigators, this clarity allows for efficiency, but it does not lessen the gravity of the task. Each case represents not just a set of facts, but the end of a life, the impact on a community, and the responsibility to ensure that the truth is established with precision and integrity. In Aberdeen, in February of 2000, that responsibility was carried out through a process that moved quickly, but carefully, from concern to discovery to confirmation and ultimately to the threshold of justice. By the time the case moved into the courtroom, much of what had happened in Aberdeen in February of 2000 was no longer in question. The investigation had established a clear and consistent account of events, supported by physical evidence and the absence of any alternative explanation. The focus of the proceedings was not to determine whether Catherine Knight had been involved in the death of John Charles Thomas Price, but rather to formalize that conclusion within the legal system and to determine the appropriate consequence under the law of Australia. In many criminal cases, the trial phase is defined by contest, by opposing narratives, by the presentation of conflicting evidence, by the effort to establish doubt or certainty in the minds of a jury. But this case did not follow that path. Instead, it took a more direct course. Catherine Knight entered a guilty plea. This decision effectively acknowledged responsibility for the killing and removed the need for a prolonged adversarial trial. There would be no extended examination of competing theories, no drawn-out process of persuasion. The central facts, already supported by the investigation, were accepted. However, a guilty plea does not diminish the seriousness of a case. If anything, it shifts the focus more sharply onto the nature of the crime itself and the appropriate response within the legal framework. The court's role, in this context, is to consider not only the act, but also its circumstances, its severity, and its implications. The absence of a contested trial does not mean the absence of scrutiny. On the contrary, it places a different kind of responsibility on the court to ensure that the sentence imposed reflects the gravity of what has occurred. In examining the case, the court would have considered the established facts: that John Price was killed within his own home, that the act occurred in the context of a personal relationship marked by prior conflict, and that the evidence pointed unequivocally to Catherine Knight as the responsible party. These elements form the foundation upon which sentencing decisions are made. They speak to both the nature of the crime and the degree of harm inflicted. In addition, the broader context of the relationship, its history of tension, the pattern of behavior attributed to Knight, and the expressed concerns of Price prior to his death, provided further insight into the circumstances leading up to the event. While these contextual factors do not alter the fundamental facts of the case, they contribute to the court's understanding of its seriousness. Sentencing in cases of this nature is not only about punishment. It is also about recognition of the harm done, of the life lost, and of the need to respond in a way that reflects the values of the legal system. In Australia, the most severe penalty available for such a crime is life imprisonment. Within that category, there exists a further distinction: whether the sentence includes the possibility of parole. In this case, the court determined that it should not. In 2001, the sentence was delivered. Catherine Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This is a rare and significant outcome, reserved for cases in which the court determines that the severity of the crime warrants the most serious form of custodial sentence available. It reflects a conclusion that the individual should remain in custody for the remainder of their life, without the prospect of conditional release. The significance of this sentence extends beyond the individual case. Catherine Knight became the first woman in Australia to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. This fact underscores the exceptional nature of the court's decision. It is not a distinction that is made lightly. It indicates that, in the judgment of the court, the circumstances of the case were such that no lesser sentence would be sufficient. At the center of this outcome is the recognition of John Price's life and the manner in which it was taken. Sentencing, in its most fundamental sense, is about accountability. It is the point at which the legal system articulates its response to a violation of its most basic principle, the protection of human life. In this case, that response was unequivocal. There would be no second phase, no future reconsideration, no conditional pathway back into society. The sentence was final in its intent and enduring in its consequence. For the community, the conclusion of the case brought a form of resolution, but not closure in the emotional sense. Legal proceedings can establish facts, assign responsibility, and impose consequences, but they cannot undo what has happened. They cannot restore what has been lost. What they can do is provide a framework within which the events are acknowledged and addressed in a manner consistent with the rule of law. The courtroom, in this sense, becomes the space where private tragedy is translated into public record, where the details of a life and its end are examined not for sensation, but for judgment. The decision to impose a sentence of life imprisonment without parole reflects not only the severity of the act, but also the court's assessment of its broader implications. It is a statement about the limits of tolerance within a society, about the point at which behavior is deemed so harmful that it warrants permanent removal from the community. In this case, that threshold was clearly met. As the proceedings concluded, the legal phase of the case came to an end. The facts had been established, the responsibility acknowledged, and the sentence imposed. What remained was the aftermath, the impact on those connected to John Price, the reflection within the wider community, and the ongoing consideration of what this case reveals about the nature of violence within relationships. The court had delivered its judgment, but the meaning of that judgment and the lessons drawn from it would continue to unfold long after the formal proceedings were over. In the aftermath of the sentencing, when the legal process had reached its conclusion and Catherine Knight had been given a life sentence without the possibility of parole, the case did not simply fade into the background. Instead, it settled into the collective awareness of the public in Australia as something deeply unsettling, not only because of what had happened, but because of what it revealed. Cases like this do not end when the courtroom doors close. They continue quietly, persistently, in the way people talk about them, in the questions they raise, and in the reflections they leave behind. At the center of those reflections is the life of John Charles Thomas Price. In many ways, he represents a kind of absence that is difficult to fully articulate. Not just the absence of a person, but the absence of routine, of presence, of continuity. He was someone who had lived a life defined by consistency, by showing up, by being part of the everyday fabric of the people around him. And then, suddenly, he was gone. The legal system acknowledged that loss, assigned responsibility for it, and imposed a sentence that reflected its seriousness. But beyond that, the impact of his absence continued to be felt in quieter, less visible ways, among those who knew him, among those who worked with him, and even among those who came to learn about the case after the fact. One of the most significant aspects of this case, in terms of its broader impact, is the way it challenged assumptions about domestic violence. Public understanding of such violence has often been shaped by patterns that emphasize one direction, of harm. This case disrupted that narrative. It demonstrated, in a stark and undeniable way, that violence within relationships can take many forms, and that the dynamics involved are not always aligned with common expectations. This is not to diminish the prevalence of other patterns, but rather to expand the conversation, to acknowledge that risk can exist in different configurations, and that awareness must be broad enough to recognize them. Another key theme that emerges from this case is the concept of escalation. The relationship between Catherine Knight and John Charles Thomas Price did not begin with violence. At its most extreme level, it developed over time, moving through stages that included conflict, reconciliation, and repeated cycles of tension. Within those cycles were warning signs, patterns of behavior that indicated instability, aggression, and control. These signs were not entirely hidden. They were present, observable, and in some cases, explicitly acknowledged. Price himself expressed fear. He communicated to others that he believed he could be harmed. This detail, perhaps more than any other, underscores the complexity of situations involving domestic instability, because it raises a difficult question: what happens when someone recognizes danger, but remains within it? The answer is not simple. Human relationships are rarely governed by logic alone. They're influenced by emotion, by history, by attachment, by hope for change, and sometimes by the difficulty of disentangling one's life from another's. Recognizing risk does not automatically provide a path to safety. There can be barriers, practical, emotional, psychological, that make leaving a dangerous situation far more complicated than it might appear from the outside. This case illustrates that complexity with painful clarity. It shows that awareness, while crucial, is not always sufficient. That intervention, whether from individuals or systems, may be necessary, but is not always present. And that when patterns of behavior are allowed to continue without effective disruption, they can escalate to irreversible outcomes. In the time following the case, there was a noticeable shift in how such situations were discussed. Greater emphasis began to be placed on early warning signs, on the importance of recognizing patterns before they reach a critical point. There was also increased attention to the need for support systems, for mechanisms that allow individuals to act on their concerns, to create distance, to seek safety. These changes are not solely the result of a single case, but cases like this contribute to the broader conversation. They provide concrete examples that can inform policy, education, and public awareness. At the same time, it is important to approach these reflections with care. There is a tendency, in looking back at cases of this nature, to search for clear lessons, for definitive conclusions that can be applied universally. But reality is more nuanced. Each situation is shaped by its own set of circumstances, its own dynamics, its own challenges. What can be taken from this case is not a simple formula, but a deeper understanding of how patterns of behavior can develop, how they can persist, and how they can ultimately lead to harm if left unaddressed. The story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight is, at its core, a story about connection and its consequences, about how two lives became intertwined in a way that led not to mutual support, but to instability and, ultimately, violence. It is a story that resists simplification, that does not fit neatly into categories of good and bad, cause and effect. Instead, it exists in a space where human behavior, personal history, and circumstance intersect in ways that are difficult to fully untangle. As time passes, the details of the case may become less immediate, less present in public discourse. But the underlying themes remain relevant. The importance of recognizing warning signs. The need to take expressions of fear seriously. The understanding that violence within relationships can escalate, sometimes gradually, sometimes unpredictably, but often with patterns that can be observed if we are willing to look closely. In the end, what remains is not just the record of what happened, but the awareness it creates. The reminder that behind every case is a life that was lived, a set of relationships that mattered, in a moment where everything changed. And perhaps most importantly, the recognition that the most dangerous situations are not always the ones that arrive without warning, but the ones that develop over time, quietly, persistently, until the point at which they can no longer be reversed. If there is a final layer to this story, beyond the investigation, beyond the courtroom, beyond even the broader societal reflection, it exists in the quiet space where individual memory and collective awareness meet. Because cases like this do not simply become history. They become reference points. They linger in conversations, in cautionary thinking, in the subtle ways people interpret risk and recognize patterns in their own lives. And in that sense, the story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight continues, not as an active case, but as an enduring presence. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that the most critical turning points in this story were not hidden. They were not invisible or unknowable. They existed in the open, in behavior, in repeated conflict, in expressed fear. Price had voiced his concerns. He had told others that he believed he could be harmed. That statement alone carries a weight that is difficult to fully process. It is not hindsight. It is not interpretation after the fact. It is foresight, an awareness of danger that existed before the outcome. And yet, despite that awareness, the situation continued. This is where the story moves beyond the specifics of a single case and enters a more complex and uncomfortable territory, because it forces us to confront a difficult truth. Recognizing danger is not the same as escaping it. There is often an assumption, especially from an external perspective, that once risk is identified, action will naturally follow. That distance will be created, that separation will occur, that safety will be secured. But reality does not always align with that expectation. Relationships, particularly those marked by cycles of conflict and reconciliation, can create a kind of inertia, a pull that is difficult to break, even when the risks are understood. Emotional ties, shared history, the hope, however fragile, that things might change, all contribute to a situation where leaving is not a single decision, but a process. And sometimes that process is incomplete. In reflecting on this case, it is also important to consider the role of those on the outside, the friends, the coworkers, the people who heard Price express his fear. Their awareness, like his, was real. They recognized that something was wrong. And yet, as is often the case in situations like this, there are limits to what others can do. Concern can be voiced. Support can be offered. But ultimately, the dynamics of the relationship remain between the individuals involved. This is not to suggest that intervention is impossible or ineffective, but rather to acknowledge that it is not always straightforward. That even when warning signs are visible, the path to preventing harm is not always clear or accessible. The case also leaves behind questions that do not have simple answers. Questions about timing, about whether there was a moment when a different decision might have changed the outcome. Questions about escalation, about how patterns that begin with tension and conflict can evolve into something far more serious. And questions about prevention, about what it means to recognize risk early enough, and what structures or support systems are necessary to act on that recognition. These are not questions that can be resolved within the confines of a single story. But they are questions that matter because they extend beyond this case. They apply to countless other situations, many of which never reach the level of public attention, but still carry the same underlying dynamics. What makes this case particularly significant is not only its outcome, but its clarity. The pattern is visible. The warning signs are identifiable. The escalation, while tragic, follows a trajectory that can be traced. And because of that, it offers something that many cases do not: an opportunity to examine those patterns in a way that is direct and unambiguous, not to assign blame beyond what has already been established, but to understand how such situations develop and how they might be recognized earlier in the future. In Australia, as in many parts of the world, conversations about domestic violence have continued to evolve. Cases like this contribute to that evolution, not by providing easy answers, but by challenging assumptions, by expanding the understanding of what such violence can look like, and by reinforcing the importance of taking all expressions of fear seriously, regardless of context or expectation. There is also, inevitably, a human dimension that resists abstraction. Behind the analysis, behind the patterns and the broader implications, there remains the simple fact of a life that ended. John Charles Thomas Price was not a concept or a case study. He was a person with routines, with relationships, with a presence that was felt by those around him. And that presence is now defined, in part, by its absence. This is perhaps the most difficult aspect of stories like this: the way they reduce complex human lives into narratives of events, into sequences that can be examined and discussed, but never fully restored. At the same time, there's a responsibility in telling these stories. A responsibility to remain accurate, to avoid distortion, to resist the urge to sensationalize. Because the purpose is not to create shock, but to create understanding. Not to dwell on the most extreme aspects, but to recognize the patterns that led there. And in doing so, to contribute, even in a small way, to a broader awareness that may help prevent similar outcomes in the future. As this story comes to a close, what remains is not a sense of resolution in the emotional sense. Legal closure was achieved. Responsibility was established. A sentence was imposed. But the deeper questions, the ones about human behavior, about relationships, about the ways in which risk is perceived and acted upon, those questions remain open. And perhaps they should, because it is in that openness, in that willingness to continue examining and reflecting, that the true impact of a case like this can be found. Not in the details alone, but in the understanding they create, and in the quiet recognition that sometimes the most important moments are not the ones that happen suddenly, without warning, but the ones that unfold gradually, where the signs are present, the risks are known, and the outcome, though not inevitable, becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. In the years that follow a case like this, what endures is not only the record of events, but the subtle shift in awareness it leaves behind. The story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight does not exist in isolation. It becomes part of a broader understanding of how relationships can change over time, how warning signs can emerge, and how difficult it can be to act on those signs, even when they are recognized. What makes this case particularly difficult to confront is not just its outcome, but the clarity with which the preceding patterns can be seen. There were no hidden complexities in the sense of unknown perpetrators or unresolved questions of responsibility. The facts were established, the sequence understood. And yet, within that clarity lies a deeper discomfort, because it suggests that the path toward the final outcome was not entirely invisible. It unfolded gradually, through cycles that repeated often enough to form a recognizable pattern. This raises an important point about how people interpret risk in their own lives. Patterns that develop over time can become normalized. What might initially appear as a warning sign can, through repetition, begin to feel familiar, even expected. Conflict becomes part of the relationship structure rather than an exception to it. Reconciliation, when it follows, can reinforce the idea that the relationship is capable of continuing, that the previous conflict was temporary rather than indicative of a deeper issue. In this way, the very cycle that signals instability can also create the illusion of resilience. For John Charles Thomas Price, the awareness of risk was present. He expressed fear. He communicated his concern to others. These are not minor details. They're central to understanding the case. They demonstrate that the danger was not only external or retrospective, but internal and immediate. And yet, despite that awareness, the connection between him and Catherine Knight remained. This is not a contradiction. It is a reflection of the complexity of human relationships. People do not always act in accordance with what they know to be safest. Decisions are influenced by emotion, by history, by the weight of shared experiences that are not easily set aside. There is also the question of how others respond when warning signs are visible. Friends and coworkers were aware that something was wrong. They heard Price express fear. They recognized that the relationship was unstable. But recognition does not always come with a clear course of action. There are limits to external intervention, particularly when the situation remains within the boundaries of a private relationship. This does not diminish the importance of awareness, but it highlights the need for systems and structures that can support individuals in situations where risk is present but not yet acted upon in a way that triggers formal intervention. In Australia, as in many places, cases like this contribute to ongoing conversations about how to better identify and respond to domestic instability. The focus has increasingly shifted toward early intervention, toward recognizing patterns before they escalate, and toward providing avenues for individuals to seek help or create distance when they feel unsafe. These are complex challenges, and they do not lend themselves to simple solutions. But each case adds to the body of understanding that informs how those challenges are approached. Another aspect of this case that continues to resonate is the idea of escalation as a process rather than a single moment. The final act of violence did not occur in isolation. It was the result of a trajectory that had been developing over time. Each cycle of conflict and reconciliation contributed to that trajectory, reinforcing patterns that were not resolved but repeated. This understanding is critical because it shifts the focus from the final moment to the entire sequence that preceded it. It suggests that prevention, if it is to be effective, must address the pattern as a whole, rather than waiting for a single defining event. At the same time, it is important to approach this understanding with care. Not every relationship that experiences conflict will escalate to violence. Not every warning sign leads to the same outcome. The presence of patterns does not guarantee a particular conclusion, but it does indicate risk, and risk, when recognized, requires attention. The challenge lies in determining how to respond in a way that is both effective and respectful of the complexities involved. As this story settles into its place within the broader landscape of true crime and public awareness, it serves as a reminder of the limits of hindsight. Looking back, the signs may appear clear, the trajectory understandable. But in the moment, those same signs can be more difficult to interpret, more easily minimized or rationalized. This is not a failure of perception, but a reflection of how human beings process experience, through context, through emotion, through the desire for stability, even in the face of uncertainty. In the end, what remains is not a sense of resolution, but a continued awareness. The life of John Charles Thomas Price, the actions of Catherine Knight, and the events that brought them to that final point in February of 2000 form a narrative that is both specific and broadly relevant. It is specific in its details, in its setting, in the individuals involved. but it is also relevant in the patterns it reveals, the questions it raises, and the understanding it contributes to a larger conversation about relationships, risk, and the ways in which violence can emerge from dynamics that, at one time, may have seemed manageable. And perhaps the most enduring aspect of that narrative is the quiet recognition that stories like this are not defined solely by their endings, but by the paths that lead to them, paths that are often visible only in retrospect, but which, when examined closely, offer insight into how such outcomes develop and how, with greater awareness, they might one day be prevented. As the story reaches its final layer, what remains is not a dramatic conclusion, but a quiet, persistent sense of reflection, one that extends beyond the specific details of what happened in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia in February of 2000. The case of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight does not end with a single moment, nor with a single interpretation. Instead, it lingers, not because of uncertainty, but because of clarity, the kind of clarity that reveals patterns which are difficult to ignore once they have been seen. At its core, this is a story about how human behavior unfolds over time and how certain dynamics, when left unresolved, can intensify in ways that are not always immediately apparent. The relationship between Price and Knight was not defined by a single event, but by repetition, by cycles that created a rhythm of instability. Conflict would arise, separation would follow, and then, at some point, reconciliation would bring them back into the same space. Each time, the possibility of change may have seemed present. Each time, the hope that things might improve could have influenced the decision to continue. But repetition, in this context, did not lead to resolution. It reinforced the very patterns that made the relationship unstable. This is one of the most difficult aspects of understanding cases like this. The recognition that patterns can persist even when they are clearly harmful. From an external perspective, it can be tempting to view the situation in simple terms, to ask why the relationship continued, why distance was not maintained, why the warning signs did not lead to a definitive break. But such questions, while natural, often overlook the complexity of human attachment. Relationships are not governed solely by logic or self-preservation. They are shaped by emotion, by shared experiences, by the passage of time and the ways in which individuals come to understand themselves in relation to one another. For John Charles Thomas Price, the awareness of danger was real. He had expressed fear, communicated his concerns, and taken steps to create distance. These actions demonstrate that he was not unaware of the risks involved. And yet, awareness alone did not result in complete separation. The connection remained, even as it became increasingly unstable. This is not an uncommon dynamic, but it is one that is often misunderstood. It illustrates the gap between recognizing a problem and being able to fully resolve it. It also highlights the importance of support systems, of having access to resources and interventions that can assist individuals in navigating situations where risk is present but difficult to escape. At the same time, the actions of Catherine Knight must be understood within the framework of responsibility. The legal process established that responsibility clearly, and the sentence imposed reflects the severity of the act. There is no ambiguity in that regard. But beyond the legal determination, there is a broader consideration of behavior, of how patterns formed over time can culminate in outcomes that are both devastating and irreversible. Understanding those patterns does not excuse the outcome, but it does provide context. It allows for a more complete examination of how such situations develop and how they might be addressed before reaching a critical point. The case also serves as a reminder of the limitations of hindsight. Looking back, it is possible to trace the trajectory with a degree of clarity that was not available in the moment. The warning signs, the expressions of fear, the repeated cycles of conflict, all of these elements form a narrative that appears, in retrospect, to lead toward a foreseeable conclusion. But in real time, those same elements may have been interpreted differently, weighed against other factors, or understood within a broader context that made immediate action more difficult. This does not diminish their significance, but it does complicate the process of responding to them. In the years since the case, discussions surrounding domestic violence and relationship dynamics have continued to evolve in Australia. Greater emphasis has been placed on early recognition, on understanding patterns of behavior, and on creating pathways for individuals to seek help when they feel unsafe. These developments are part of an ongoing effort to address the complexities revealed by cases like this. They reflect a growing awareness that prevention requires not only knowledge, but also accessible support and effective intervention. And yet, even as these conversations progress, the fundamental challenges remain. Human relationships are inherently complex, and the factors that influence them are varied and deeply personal. There is no single solution, no universal approach that can address every situation. What can be done is to continue examining cases like this with care and precision, to learn from the patterns they reveal, and to apply that understanding in ways that may reduce the likelihood of similar outcomes in the future. Ultimately, the story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight is not defined solely by its ending, but by the sequence of events that led there. It is a story that challenges assumptions, that resists simplification, and that requires a willingness to engage with difficult questions. It asks us to consider not only what happened, but how and why it happened, and what that means in a broader context. As a narrative comes to a close, there is no sense of resolution in the traditional sense. The legal process has concluded, the facts have been established, and the outcome is final. But the implications of the case, its insights into human behavior, its contribution to ongoing conversations about violence and relationships remain active. They continue to influence how such situations are understood, how warning signs are interpreted, and how responses are shaped. And perhaps that is where the true significance of this story lies, not in the details alone, but in the awareness it creates. An awareness that extends beyond a single case, beyond a single moment, into a broader understanding of how lives can become intertwined in ways that are both meaningful and, at times, profoundly dangerous. An awareness that reminds us that the most important stories are not always the ones that end with clear answers, but the ones that leave us with a deeper understanding of the questions themselves. In the final reflection on what happened in Aberdeen in February of 2000, the story settles into something quieter, more introspective, less about the sequence of events and more about what those events reveal when viewed as a whole. The lives of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight intersected in a way that ultimately led to irreversible harm. But the significance of that intersection extends beyond the moment in which it ended. It exists in the patterns that preceded it, in the awareness that surrounded it, and in the understanding that continues to develop long after the case itself has concluded. What stands out most, when all elements are considered together, is the gradual nature of the trajectory. There was no single moment that defined the outcome from the beginning. Instead, there was a progression, subtle at first, then increasingly pronounced, where conflict became more frequent, where instability became more apparent, and where the possibility of escalation moved from theoretical to real. This progression is not unique to this case, and that is precisely what makes it so important to examine. It reflects a broader reality about how certain dynamics within relationships can evolve, often without a clear boundary between what is manageable and what is dangerous. For John Charles Thomas Price, the recognition of risk was present, and it was articulated. He expressed concern, he communicated fear, and he attempted, at least in part, to create distance. These actions suggest a level of awareness that is critical in understanding the case. They indicate that the situation was not misunderstood or ignored entirely, but rather experienced with a degree of clarity that makes the outcome all the more difficult to process. Because when awareness exists, there is often an expectation, both internal and external, that it will lead to safety. And when it does not, the question becomes not only what happened, but why the path from recognition to protection was not completed. This is where the complexity of human behavior becomes most evident. Decisions are rarely made in isolation. They're influenced by context, by emotion, by the accumulation of past experiences that shape how present circumstances are interpreted. In relationships that have developed over time, where there have been moments of connection alongside moments of conflict, the decision to leave or to remain is rarely simple. It involves weighing not only the risks, but also the perceived benefits, the emotional ties, and the hope, however uncertain, that change is possible. This does not diminish the reality of the risk, but it does complicate the response to it. At the same time, the responsibility for the outcome rests clearly within the framework established by the legal system. The actions of Catherine Knight were examined, judged, and resulted in the most severe form of sentence available under the law of Australia. That aspect of the case is definitive. It provides a form of closure within the legal context, a clear acknowledgement of accountability and consequence. But legal closure does not equate to emotional resolution, nor does it fully address the broader implications of what occurred. Those implications continue to unfold in the way the case is understood, discussed, and remembered. One of the enduring lessons of this case is the importance of recognizing patterns not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger structure. Conflict, when repeated without resolution, does not remain static. It evolves, it intensifies, and without intervention, it can reach a point where the consequences become irreversible. This understanding has informed ongoing discussions about how to approach situations involving domestic instability, how to identify risk earlier, how to support individuals who express fear, and how to create systems that allow for effective intervention before escalation occurs. In Australia, these discussions have contributed to a broader awareness that extends beyond this single case. They reflect an effort to move from reaction to prevention, from responding after harm has occurred to identifying and addressing the conditions that make such harm possible. This is a complex and ongoing process, one that requires not only awareness, but also resources, coordination, and a willingness to engage with difficult and often uncomfortable realities about how relationships function under stress. As the narrative comes to its final point, there is a sense of stillness, not the stillness of resolution, but the stillness of reflection. The events have been examined, the facts established, the consequences imposed. What remains is the understanding that emerges from that examination, an understanding that is not confined to this case alone, but applicable to a wider range of situations where similar patterns may exist. The story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight does not offer simple answers. It does not provide a clear path from problem to solution. Instead, it presents a set of realities that must be acknowledged, that relationships can become unstable in ways that are difficult to navigate, that warning signs can be recognized but not fully acted upon, and that escalation, once it reaches a certain point, can lead to outcomes that cannot be undone. And perhaps the most important aspect of this final reflection is the recognition that awareness, while not always sufficient on its own, is still essential. It is the first step in understanding, in identifying risk, in creating the possibility for change. Cases like this, difficult as they are to examine, contribute to that awareness. They serve as reminders of what can happen when patterns of behavior are left unaddressed, and of the importance of taking those patterns seriously when they appear. In the end, the story does not conclude with a definitive statement, but with an open awareness, a recognition that the lessons it carries are ongoing, that the questions it raises remain relevant, and that the understanding it provides can, if applied carefully and thoughtfully, contribute to preventing similar tragedies in the future. At the very end of this story, what lingers is not a single image or a defining moment, but a quiet accumulation of understanding, something that forms gradually, much like the events that led to that February night in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia. The case of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight resists being reduced to a simple narrative. It is not a story that can be contained within the boundaries of crime and punishment alone. Instead, it extends outward, touching on themes of human behavior, perception, and the often difficult process of recognizing when a situation has crossed from unstable into dangerous. What makes this case particularly enduring is the way it challenges the idea that danger always arrives suddenly, without warning. In many stories, harm is framed as something unexpected, a moment that disrupts an otherwise ordinary sequence of events. But here, the disruption was preceded by signals, by patterns that developed over time. The relationship between Price and Knight was not defined by a single point of failure. It was shaped by repetition, by cycles that reinforced themselves rather than resolving. And within those cycles were indicators, conflict that did not dissipate, behavior that did not stabilize, and a sense of unease that grew more difficult to ignore. For John Charles Thomas Price, that unease became explicit. He expressed fear. He articulated a concern that went beyond ordinary relationship difficulty. This is a detail that continues to resonate, because it places awareness at the center of the narrative. It shows that the risk was not hidden or entirely misunderstood. It was felt, recognized, and communicated. And yet, as the story demonstrates, awareness alone does not always provide a clear path forward. There's often a gap between recognizing danger and being able to fully remove oneself from it. That gap can be influenced by many factors: emotional attachment, shared history, the hope that circumstances might improve, or simply the challenge of making a decisive break from something that has become deeply familiar. This is not a justification, but a recognition of complexity. Human decisions are rarely made in isolation, and they're not always aligned with what might appear, from an outside perspective, to be the safest course of action. At the same time, the responsibility for the outcome remains clearly defined. The legal system in Australia established that responsibility and imposed a sentence that reflects the seriousness of the act. Catherine Knight will remain in custody for the rest of her life, without the possibility of parole. This outcome is final in a legal sense, but it does not bring with it a sense of emotional resolution. Instead, it marks the point at which the formal process ends and the broader implications begin to take shape. Those implications are not confined to this case alone. They extend into how similar situations are understood, how warning signs are interpreted, and how responses are developed in both personal and institutional contexts. The case contributes to an ongoing conversation about domestic violence, one that increasingly recognizes the importance of early intervention, of taking expressions of fear seriously, and of understanding that patterns of behavior, when repeated over time, can indicate a trajectory toward escalation. It also highlights the need for support systems that can assist individuals in navigating these situations, particularly when the path to safety is not straightforward. Awareness is essential, but it must be accompanied by accessible resources and practical options for those who find themselves in difficult or dangerous circumstances. As this story reaches its final reflection, there's a sense of stillness that follows. Not the stillness of resolution, but the stillness of acknowledgement. The events have been examined, the facts understood, and the consequences established. What remains is the recognition of what those events reveal, not only about the individuals involved, but about the broader patterns that can exist within human relationships. Patterns that, if left unexamined, can continue to develop beneath the surface, becoming more entrenched over time. The story of John Charles Thomas Price is, in many ways, defined by absence, by the space left behind when a life ends unexpectedly. But it is also defined by the presence of the lessons that emerge from that loss. Lessons that are not simple or easily applied, but which nonetheless contribute to a deeper understanding of how such situations can arise. In the story of Catherine Knight, while firmly situated within the framework of legal accountability, also exists as part of that broader understanding, illustrating how patterns of behavior, shaped over time, can culminate in outcomes that are both devastating and irreversible. In the end, this is not a story that concludes with a sense of closure in the traditional sense. There is no moment where everything resolves neatly, where all questions are answered and all implications fully understood. Instead, it remains open to reflection, to interpretation, to continued examination. And perhaps that is where its true significance lies, not in providing definitive answers, but in prompting ongoing awareness, in encouraging a closer look at the patterns that exist within relationships, at the ways in which risk is recognized and addressed, and at the importance of responding to that risk before it reaches a point where it can no longer be changed. In the final moments of reflection, after the facts have been laid out and the sequence of events has been carefully examined, what remains is something quieter, more enduring, a sense of awareness that extends beyond the boundaries of this single case. The story of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight does not conclude in the way many narratives do. There is no resolution that restores balance, no outcome that can fully account for what has been lost. Instead, there is a recognition, one that builds gradually as each part of the story is considered in relation to the whole. That recognition begins with the understanding that what happened in Aberdeen, New South Wales, Australia in February of 2000 was not the result of a single moment, but the culmination of a pattern shaped by repeated conflict, by unresolved tension, and by behaviors that, over time, move from concerning to dangerous. It is within that pattern that the deeper meaning of the case can be found, not as an abstract concept, but as a reflection of how human relationships can evolve under pressure and how those evolutions, if left unaddressed, can lead to irreversible outcomes. For John Charles Thomas Price, the awareness of that pattern was present. He recognized the instability, he expressed fear, and he attempted to create distance. These actions are significant, not only because they demonstrate his perception of the situation, but because they highlight the gap that can exist between recognition and resolution. Understanding that something is wrong does not always provide a clear or immediate path to safety. There are complexities, emotional, practical, psychological, that can make decisive action difficult, even when the risk is understood. This is one of the most challenging aspects of cases involving domestic instability. They do not follow a simple progression from problem to solution. Instead, they often involve cycles, periods of tension followed by reconciliation, moments of clarity followed by doubt, attempts at distance followed by renewed connection. Each cycle reinforces the relationship in some way, even as it introduces new risks. And over time, those risks can accumulate, becoming more difficult to manage, more likely to escalate. At the same time, the actions of Catherine Knight remained central to the outcome. The legal process established responsibility clearly, and the sentence imposed reflects the seriousness of that responsibility within the framework of the law in Australia. That aspect of the case is definitive. It provides a clear answer to the question of accountability. But beyond that, it also contributes to a broader understanding of how patterns of behavior, particularly those involving aggression and control, can develop over time and lead to severe consequences if not addressed. As this story reaches its final conclusion, it leaves behind more than a record of events. It leaves behind a set of questions about how relationships function under strain, about how warning signs are interpreted, and about what it means to respond effectively when risk is identified. These questions do not have simple answers, and they are not confined to this case alone. They apply to a wide range of situations, many of which never reach public attention, but which nonetheless involve similar dynamics. In Australia, and in many other parts of the world, cases like this contribute to an ongoing effort to better understand and address domestic violence. That effort includes recognizing that such violence is not always visible in its most extreme form from the beginning, that it can develop gradually, and that early intervention is critical. It also includes acknowledging that individuals who recognize danger may still face significant barriers in acting on that recognition, and that support systems must be designed to address those barriers in practical and accessible ways. Ultimately, the significance of this case lies not only in what happened, but in what it reveals. It reveals the importance of paying attention to patterns, of taking expressions of fear seriously, and of understanding that escalation, once it begins, can be difficult to reverse without intervention. It also reveals the limitations of hindsight, the way in which events can appear clear and inevitable when viewed after the fact, but far more complex and uncertain when experienced in real time. As the narrative comes to an end, there is no attempt to impose a final interpretation, no effort to reduce the story to a single lesson. Instead, there is an acknowledgement of its complexity, of the multiple layers that contribute to its meaning. The lives of John Charles Thomas Price and Catherine Knight intersected in a way that led to a tragic outcome. But the understanding of that outcome continues to evolve as it is examined and reflected upon. And perhaps that is the most enduring aspect of the story, that it does not end with a definitive conclusion, but with an ongoing awareness, an awareness that extends beyond this case, beyond this moment, into a broader understanding of how similar situations can develop and how, through careful attention and thoughtful response, they might one day be prevented.